All right, guys, so we're back. And last time we met on the last video, it was really about factory life. And today we're going to be discussing kind of what comes after that. We understand that millions of workers are in poverty, they're kind of stuck in that cycle. They suffer from low pay, they suffer from lack of education, they have very few workers' rights. The conditions in which they work in mines and factories are just untenable. They're terrible conditions. And so, what they're going to begin to do is they're going to begin to try to organize. They recognize that there is power in numbers, there's strength in numbers if they'll hold together. Now, we know that the ownership, they have money, they have political connections, there's power in that as well. But if the workers can unionize and get together on some of these things, then they're hoping that they can make gains in terms of improved pay, hours, and working conditions. So they're going to try to work together to achieve those means. Ultimately, that's what unions are, right? And so what we're going to see is I'm going to show you a few of the early unions, kind of their growth and maybe even their demise, right? But what we'll see is the National Labor Union is the very first one, the first big one, right? And it really focuses on skilled labor. They feel like that's harder to replace because that investment has been made in training. The people that have those skills are fewer and further in between. So they're looking at skilled labor and they're really focused only on male workers. They're less concerned with women. They're looking for the rights of lower class working men who are struggling to provide for their families. So that is the National Labor Union. They're really urging members to be good citizens. They don't want to appear radical. They love the U.S., what it stands for, and they want good citizens. They're really fighting for an 8-hour workday. The 10 and 12-hour shifts feel too long to them, and they're simply wanting an improvement in their condition where they can make a livable wage, but still have time to raise a family and go to church and do the normal things that we need time to do. By 1860s, they're going to have over 600,000 members. That's a lot of workers. Now, it's a small fraction in comparison to the overall number of workers, but remember, they were skilled workers. Now, the next one that we're going to see is called the Knights of Labor. And the Knights of Labor are going to be led by a guy named Terence Powderly. Now, he is much more accepting, much more open, and they begin to accept both skilled and unskilled labor. So it didn't matter to them if you were somebody who had spent years as an apprentice and became a master of whatever it was you were doing, a journeyman, and so forth. Or if you were somebody who had no skills but simply operated a machine, you were a worker, you were important. And they allowed both male and female workers to join, as well as all races. It didn't matter to them if you were a white worker, a black worker, male or female. Everybody was really welcome because it was kind of this large collective workers' union. So a little bit more progressive in terms of equality and who they accepted. Now, the Knights of Labor also pushed for an 8-hour workday. We're going to see that that becomes a pretty standard thing for unions. They are going to take some of those union dues and they're going to begin to back political candidates, people who will support what they support. If you're a candidate and you don't back an 8-hour workday in Congress, then you can't expect any donations or contributions from the Knights of Labor. They also wanted to push for an end to child labor. That was something that was of great concern to lower class families because so many of their children had to go into work, had to work in factories and mines and selling newspapers and shining shoes and doing the types of work that they could do to help make the family's ends meet. Um, Ultimately, the Knights of Labor really wanted to abolish the wage labor system. So, up until that point, we're kind of on board, right? No child labor. That sounds like a great thing. An 8-hour workday. We love that, right? Um, a lot more equality in terms of the races and the sexes. That's great. But when you start getting into abolish the wage labor system and have worker controlled and owned industries and government control of infrastructure, then it kind of changes and starts to look like it's a fringe group because that's very much the ideals of socialism and taking us down that route. The people who worked hard to build companies and got educated and and have poured their life's work into one company, they don't like the idea of having that taken from them and placed under government control. Now, to be fair to the Knights of Labor, a lot of what they were looking at under government control were things like railroads and utilities, things that we might consider infrastructure today. But they were still privately owned companies. And the people who had worked to build those and made their names and their fortunes in those industries didn't really like that idea. So the Knights of Labor begin to look a little radical. And that is amplified when we see things like the Haymarket Square riot, where policemen are killed and a bomb explodes, and all of a sudden, that starts to feel a lot more radical, and their membership plummets. It goes down to almost nothing. Now, out of those ashes, and with other unions around, we're going to see one that really rises to power, and that's the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, which is still with us today, although it's merged with CIO, the AFL CIO, right? What we will see is that the American Federation of Labor is led by a man by the name of Samuel Gompers, and it focuses again more on skilled labor. They feel like they have more leverage if they're working with skilled labor. And they had over 1 million members by the turn of the century. By 1900, well over 1 million members. They were pushing hard for the 8-hour workday, right? They say 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, and 8 hours for what we will. We need rest if we're going to work our best. We need time to, again, take care of the home and raise the children and go to church. And so they said, look, 24-hour period splits up nicely into 3 8-hour time periods, and we're willing to give one of those to work, but we need one to rest and we need one to just live our lives, right? So the 8-hour workday, they really pushed too for better wages. They wanted improved safety in the factories, and they wanted some benefits that would guarantee a job to come back to if there was an injury, those sorts of things, right? They wanted to take care of their workers and make sure that they were provided for if they were injured on the job. So another one that we're going to take a look at is far more radical, more radical even than the Knights of Labor, right? This is the International Workers of the World. And it's because of the International Workers of the World that so many unions got painted as socialistic, radical, fringe groups. They were really very radical. They were very socialistic in terms of what they advocated for. I'm going to zoom in on this political cartoon. You know I love political cartoons because this is the I.W.W, the International Workers of the World, and they are holding a knife poised over capitalism. This is going to be the weapon. Industrial unionization, right, is going to be the weapon wielded by the I.W.W to kill capitalism. They see capitalism as the root of all evil, of wars, of child labor, of poverty, of wage slavery, prostitution. That's all in the clutches of this beast of capitalism. Now, I think it's fair that we point out that even under socialism, prostitution and poverty exist, and that there's all sorts of different things going on there. So it may not be the most sound worldview, but it was their worldview. And because they were radical and because they used some of those tactics and inflammatory language, it really made it easy for the opponents of unions to paint all unions with one broad brush. Because the the International Workers of the World, the I.W.W, really left a nasty taste in people's mouths. It was too much, too fast. It was a dramatic change from what the American system really was, that system of capitalism. And this is something that, because it's international, we really felt like that was being imported here from other countries. As people immigrated here, they were bringing with them radical socialistic ideas. Now, unions and management are often going to clash, but usually it was the owners that had the more powerful tools, right? And so what we're going to see is that union tactics are going to be things like negotiations, or at least they're going to attempt to. It's going to be slowdowns where they slow the pace of work. You've heard the idea that time is money, right? So if we slow down the factory, if we make it less efficient, then the owners are losing money. There may even be limited walkouts, right? We're going to walk out and shut it down for a day just to make our point that we have some power, that we have some ability to do damage to your bottom line. Other tactics might be protests and rallies. We see those all the time. Even today, you'll have meetings and protests and rallies. They weren't above, in some cases, using sabotage or violence in order to make a point. But the big weapon here was strikes. If they could get everybody on board and everybody leave the factory, and not only leave the factory, but then stand in front of it to make sure that nobody else came in and that nothing was being produced, well, then maybe they had some leverage, right? Now, management tactics. How did they overcome this, or how did they combat that? We said they had more powerful tools most of the time. First of all, they often operated closed shops. And what that means is they simply did not allow unions to emerge within their workplace. If people came to try to sign people up for unions, or there was talk of somebody trying to collectively bargain and get people on board with that, then they were released immediately. They were fired. They weren't allowed in the building. So nobody wanted them to agitate for something that management knew was going to cost them money if it succeeded. So they didn't allow unions to emerge. There are still places today that don't allow unions. The other tool that they had was Pinkertons, or private security. And here we see a couple of Pinkerton badges. These were nationally kind of licensed private detectives. They could carry weapons, and so they acted as almost a private security force, a private army working on behalf of the management to secure the facilities. Sometimes they were used, that people were hired as strike breakers and that sort of stuff to run people out of the front of the factory so that replacement workers could be brought in. Um, Management tactics also included what we call scabs, or temporary replacement workers. So if you're going to go on strike, that's fine. I can go on down to the docks. There's a ship of immigrants coming in, and all of them are looking for jobs, right? So I can hire those people on a temporary basis. The fear of unions is that if temporary workers go in and the factory runs, then their strike is effectively useless. Not only that, their job is on the line, because what if the management recognizes that the replacement workers can do the job just as well as the old striking workers, and they're not the ones giving us a headache. So scabs were really looked down upon. Oftentimes they were attacked or beaten and kind of ostracized in the community if you took a temporary worker job. But it was easy to find scabs because unemployment was high and people needed work. The last thing, and really the most important thing, is really hiring and firing. That's a tactic of the management. They didn't have to have an excuse to fire you. And if you wanted a job and everybody needed a job, then you needed to keep your head down and you needed to work and you needed to not cause trouble, right? So they had the ability to replace you. And let's be honest, you're easily replaceable for most of the workers, right? Not all. Some of them were highly skilled. Some of them were more educated and had been invested in their training. But an awful lot of people were machine operators, or they did a task that really anybody could be trained very quickly to do. If you are unskilled, if you are uneducated, then you're easily replaced. And as long as workers are easily replaced, it's going to be hard for them to gain traction against management. So unions have very, very few early wins. They do get some, but as time goes on and they become more popular and more people join, they do start to gradually find more success. Now, some of the wins that they get, some of the things that they advocated for, were given freely by certain companies that were trying to compete for better workers. Henry Ford was incredible at this. He recognized the need. Now it's a little bit later on, right? But he recognized the need to give people a little bit more of what they wanted in order to keep the best employees, in order to keep them happy and working hard. So unions do gradually find more success, a little bit more power, and more influence with the people and with government and against management. But there's always this kind of ebb and flow. They rise and then they fall in power, and then they rise and fall in power. But this is definitely one of the rising times. So we still have unions today. People will discuss all sorts of things about that, the usefulness, and do they still play as important a role now as they did then, since so many of the things they fought for won and have become very standard, and that government now has regulations on businesses. So there's a lot of things going on there, but this was an important period of time for workers' rights, and all of these things had to be really hard fought in order to win. So, guys, I want to thank you for watching. Leave me any comments. There's a lot that we didn't get to talk about, and be sure that you subscribe. Thanks, guys. We'll catch you next time.